Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. I'm glad you're here because today's story is one that's going to sit with you for a while. We get a lot of stories on this channel. Men who came here chasing something: love, sunshine, a second act, a cheaper beer. And most of those stories have the same rough shape: the dream, the fall, the reckoning. But every once in a while, a story comes in that stops you. Not because of the drama of it, not because of the money, but because of who the man was before he ever set foot on a plane. Today's story is about a man named Brendan. He's 65 years old. He's from County Leitrim, in the rural northwest of Ireland. He spent the better part of his adult life working underground, a coal miner, first at Arigna, then in Scotland, then England. A man who measured his words carefully and trusted what his hands could do. A man who had, by most measures, a quiet and decent life. And then that life changed. And then he came here. I'm not going to tell you what happened in those 14 months in the Philippines. That's his to tell. What I will say is this. When Brendan sat down to share his story, he didn't talk about being scammed. He didn't talk about being naive. He talked about his hands, and what they needed to do, and what happens to a man when that need gets turned against him. This one's going to stick with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I'll start where it started, which is underground, because everything about me starts there, if I'm honest. I was 17 when I went down Arigna for the first time, County Roscommon, the only coal mine in the whole of the Republic, tucked up into the hills above Loughlin like it was hiding. Small operation, not like the big English collieries you'd have heard of. But coal is coal, and dark is dark, and your first morning underground is your first morning underground regardless of where it is in the world. You don't forget it. What they don't tell you before you go down is the silence. People think it's noisy in a mine, and it is, when machines are running, when there's work happening. But there are moments when a shift changes, when something pauses, and the silence down there is a different kind of silence to anything you've ever heard above ground. It has weight to it. You feel it in your chest. I spent 40 years learning to read that silence, learning what it meant when it changed. That skill kept me alive more than once. Arigna closed in 1990. They gave us our redundancy and a handshake, and that was the end of it. I was 30. Mary Reed and I had been married 4 years. We had a house in Roscommon, nothing fancy but ours. And now I had no work. So I followed the work. That's what men like me did. Longanet, over in Scotland, Seafield. Then contract maintenance work in the English collieries through the 90s and into the 2000s, going wherever the contracts were, coming home when I could. It wasn't the life we'd imagined when we were young and foolish about things, but it was a life. Mairead held the house together while I was away. She was better at most things than I was, certainly at talking. God, the woman could talk. She had opinions on everything, and she'd share them whether you asked or not. I used to wind her up about it, told her she'd talk the paint off a fence. Looking back, I understand now that I never had to be particularly good at conversation myself, because she was there to do it for both of us. I just had to listen, which suited me fine. Listening was something I knew how to do. My knees gave out eventually. The body keeps its own accounts, and eventually it presents the bill. I was 58, still doing contract work up in Yorkshire, and the knees said enough, and I had to agree with them. I came home to Roscommon, came home to Mairead, and for a few years it was actually lovely. Quiet and ordinary, and lovely in the way that quiet, ordinary things are when you've spent decades away from them. Then she found the lump. Ovarian cancer. They caught it, they said, at a manageable stage. That word, manageable. I've thought about it a lot since. It managed us, I'll tell you that much. 3 years. The first year was treatment and hope and the particular exhaustion of hospitals. The waiting rooms, the car parks, the terrible coffee, the way you learn the nurses' names and they learn yours, and that familiarity that grows up around illness. The second year was harder. The third year I don't talk about in detail because there are no words in English or Irish that do it justice, and I've no interest in trying. The last 18 months I was her nurse, full-time. I learned things about caring for a person that I never expected to know. How to manage medication schedules. How to move someone who is in pain without causing more pain. How to wash someone's hair when they can't lift their own arms. Small, precise, important things. My hands learned a whole new set of skills they'd never needed before. She died on a Tuesday morning in November. The rain was going sideways outside the window, the way it does in the west of Ireland in November, like it has somewhere to be. I was in the chair beside her bed, where I'd slept the last several weeks, and then she was gone. I sat there for 4 hours before I called anyone. My daughter Sinead rang twice, and I let it go to message. I don't fully know why, even now. I think I just wasn't ready for the world to know yet. Once you make that call, it becomes official, and there's a machinery that starts up and it never really stops. I just wanted 4 more hours where it was still just us. After that, I don't remember the next few months very clearly. There was a funeral and a mass and people bringing food to the house. There was paperwork. There was a particular kind of silence in every room that was nothing like the underground silence I knew. That silence had weight. This silence had absence. 8 months after she died, I sold the house. I know some people thought that was too soon. Sinead said nothing, but I could tell she had thoughts about it. But I couldn't walk past Mairead's kitchen without something happening in my chest that I had no name for, and I'd spent enough time with things that had no name. I needed to stop living inside the evidence of her. The house sold for more than we'd paid, obviously. That's how it went everywhere. €155,000 landed in my account in April and sat there doing nothing. It felt wrong, that money. It felt like I'd exchanged something irreplaceable for something I had no use for. I wasn't sleeping well. I'd go to bed at 10 and lie there until 2, then give up and sit in the kitchen. And at some point I started watching YouTube on my phone with the headphones in, just to have something in my ears that wasn't the house. I got into the retirement channels, expat channels, men my age who'd gone somewhere warm and were telling the camera about it with great enthusiasm. The Philippines came up again and again. I watched probably 50 hours of those videos over 3 or 4 months. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't watching them because I wanted a young girlfriend. I saw plenty of lads on those channels with young Filipino women on their arm, and that wasn't what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for anything particular, if I'm honest. I was just looking, trying to find a reason to get up in the morning that didn't involve this house in this town with this silence. There was one fella I kept coming back to. Scottish, retired electrician, based somewhere called Dumaguete, down in the Visayas. He wasn't flashy. He didn't have a young girlfriend. He just kept walking around this small city by the sea saying things like, "It's quiet here, it suits me, there's no pressure to be anything." That word, quiet. He used it the way I used to use it about the underground. A particular quality of quiet, not empty. Just not competing with anything. I looked up flights in February. I booked one in early March, one way because I had nowhere to be back here that needed me. I told Sinead I was going on a holiday. That was 14 months ago. I flew into Cebu first. That's where the international flights land if you're coming from Europe into Mactan, Cebu. Then a connection or a ferry south to the Visayas. I'd done my reading. I knew the route. Cebu Airport was loud in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not angry loud. Just relentlessly alive. People everywhere. All of them seeming to know exactly where they were going and in no particular hurry to get there, despite the noise. The heat hit me the moment I stepped outside the terminal. Not just warmth, but weight. The kind of heat that has a physical presence, like it's leaning on you. I stood on the pavement outside Arrivals, with my one bag and the smell of exhaust and something frying somewhere, and I thought, right, well, here you are, Brendan. I took a domestic flight down to Dumaguete the next morning. 25 minutes in a small propeller plane over water so blue it looked painted. I watched it out the window the whole way. When I landed, I had no plan beyond the name of a guest house I'd found online and the general direction of the seafront. The boulevard. That's what they call it. The Rizal Boulevard, running along the waterfront, lined with acacia trees that throw shade in the morning if you're on the right side. I walked it that first afternoon, still dazed from the travel, and I understood immediately why that Scottish fella had kept using the word quiet. It wasn't silent. There were tricycles puttering past, students from the university in groups, vendors selling fish balls from little carts on wheels. But there was no roaring to it, no city trying to impress you. Dumaguete had looked at itself some years ago and decided it was fine as it was, and left it at that. I found that deeply appealing. I sorted the apartment within the first week. A place just off the boulevard, one bedroom, tiled floors, a ceiling fan that actually turned and did something useful, unlike the ornamental ones I'd see in some of the glossier expat videos. 21,000 pesos a month, which worked out to about €380, for a furnished apartment with hot water and a working kitchen. I stood in the middle of it the first night and thought about what that same money would get you in Roscommon, which was roughly nothing, and felt something that took me a moment to identify as relief. I found the Carinderia by accident on the third morning. I'd been eating at a little restaurant near the boulevard, the kind of place that has a laminated menu and ceiling fans and serves decent enough adobo, but it felt too much like a place designed for people like me, and I didn't want that. I wanted somewhere ordinary. I turned off the main road and walked a few streets in, and there it was, a narrow shopfront with 4 plastic tables on the pavement outside, a woman behind a glass counter with pots of food arranged in front of her, a hand-painted sign I couldn't read, and the smell of garlic frying in oil at 7 in the morning, which is apparently the Philippines' version of a welcome mat. I sat down and pointed at things, and was brought a bowl of sinanjag garlic fried rice with a fried egg on top, and a small cup of very strong instant coffee, and it cost me less than €1, and I ate every bit of it. Her name was Nane Coring, mid-50s, stout, ran the Carinderia with her daughter and a rotating cast of young relatives who appeared and disappeared depending on the day. She spoke decent English and had the manner of a woman who had been feeding people her entire life and considered it a serious responsibility. Within 3 mornings, she knew I took 2 coffees, not 1, and that I had no objection to the pork dishes that some of the other Western men apparently refused. Within a week, she was greeting me by name. She pronounced it Brendine, which I never corrected, and sending her daughter to check if I needed anything else before I'd finished my first cup. I want to explain something about that, because it matters to the story. I'd spent 40 years in an industry where men looked out for each other in a particular way. Practical, unspoken, without a lot of ceremony. You noticed if a man's lamp was running low. You checked the supports before you trusted them. That kind of care. And then I'd spent 3 years being my Riyadh's carer. And that was a different kind, more intimate and more exhausting, but also grounded in the same basic act of paying attention to another person's needs. And then she was gone, and I was paying attention to nothing and nobody, and my hands didn't know what to do with themselves. When Nane Coring sent her daughter over to check on my coffee, it sounds like a small thing. It was a small thing, but I felt it somewhere specific in my chest, that small thing. The expats were around, of course. Dumaguete has its share. A few at the boulevard bars in the evenings, older men mostly, some with young Filipino girlfriends on their arm, some alone with a San Miguel and a look on their face like they were still deciding something. I kept a civil distance. I wasn't judging them. I was in no position to judge anyone, but I hadn't come here for that, and I didn't want to be absorbed into a group of men comparing complaints about visa renewals and exchange rates. Not yet, anyway. I spent my days walking mostly. I hired a habal one afternoon. That's a motorbike taxi. A lad on a motorbike who takes you where you need to go and charges you about 60 pesos for the privilege, and had him take me up into the hills behind the city just to see what was there. Green everywhere, the kind of green that has layers to it. Rice terraces in places. Small barangays with roosters and children and laundry. I sat on a wall overlooking the coast at one point and thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time I'd managed that in about 2 years. I went to the cathedral on the second Sunday, St. Catherine of Alexandria, right in the middle of town. Old Spanish colonial building, thick walls, cool inside even in the heat. Mass in Filipino, which I obviously didn't understand a word of, but the rhythms of it were familiar enough. I sat near the back. I lit a candle for Merid afterward, in the alcove near the side door. Said a few words in my head. It felt less strange than I'd expected it to. She would have liked the cathedral, I thought. She would have had opinions about the architecture. Nanay Coring mentioned her niece for the first time about 2 weeks in. Casual. Not a setup, or at least not one that announced itself as such. Just a remark between a fried egg and a second coffee. She has a niece, a nursing aide, very hard-working, lives just nearby. Such a difficult situation. The husband gone. I made a noise that indicated I'd heard her. I didn't ask any questions. I finished my breakfast and left. I didn't think about it again that day, or the next. I was sleeping better, which I noted with something close to surprise. The heat had its own sedative quality once you stopped fighting it. The ceiling fan turned. The street sounds outside tricycles, distant karaoke. The occasional rooster who kept irregular hours became a kind of white noise that my body apparently found acceptable. I'd lie down and be gone within 20 minutes, which hadn't happened in Roscommon in the 2 years before I left. I didn't interrogate that too closely. I was just glad of it. She appeared on a Saturday morning, about 3 weeks after I arrived. I was at my usual table, the one nearest the wall with the good shade, working through my sinangag and watching a stray cat attempt to negotiate with a fishbowl vendor across the street. Nanay Coring came out with my second coffee, and there was a woman with her, not introduced exactly, just placed. Nanay Coring said something in Visayan, gestured vaguely at the empty chair across from me, and then went back inside as if she had somewhere urgent to be, which she almost certainly did not. The woman sat down. She looked at me the way people do when they're deciding whether to bother. And then she said good morning, and I said good morning, and that was the beginning of it. Her name was Neline, 38 years old, though she looked older in the way that people who work hard and sleep not enough often do. She was wearing the kind of clothes you wear when you're going about your actual life. Dark trousers, a plain blouse, practical shoes, hair pulled back, no effort toward appearance beyond basic tidiness. I noticed the absence of effort because I'd been in Dumaguete long enough to have seen the other thing. The version of a Filipino woman who is dressed for a Western man, which has a particular presentation to it that I'd clocked without anyone explaining it to me. This wasn't that. We sat in silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable silence. I'm good at silence. So apparently was she. Then she asked me what coal mining was actually like. Not where was I from, not how long was I staying, not did I like the Philippines. She asked what it was like to work underground. She said her father had done construction work his whole life, hard physical work, and she'd always wondered about men who chose to go into the earth by choice. I should tell you something. In the 2 odd years between Myreed dying and me sitting at that plastic table, I don't think anyone had asked me a question about my life and then waited for the actual answer. People asked how I was getting on, and you said fine. And that was the social transaction completed. But she asked a real question, and she had the look of someone who intended to hear whatever came back. So I told her about Arigna, about the first time going down. The weight of the silence, the way the darkness down there is different from any darkness above ground, because it's total. No eyes adjusting, no shapes forming, just nothing, until your lamp makes its small circle of world. About the community of it, the men you trusted with your actual life every shift. About Longanet in Scotland, the scale of it compared to Arigna, like moving from a village to a city while staying underground. I talked for a long time. She listened the whole way through, asked one or two questions that showed she'd been following. When I stopped talking, I realized my coffee had gone cold. I didn't remember drinking it. I said something like, "Sorry, I've gone on a bit there." She said she wasn't sorry. She said it was interesting. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. That evening I sat on the boulevard and watched the sun go into the sea. It does something extraordinary here. The way the light goes, all orange and pink, very theatrical. My Redhead would have photographed it relentlessly, and I thought, I'd talked more in that 1 hour than in the 2 years since she died. What does that tell you? About how quietly desperate I was for someone to simply hear me. We met again the following Saturday without arranging it, which I understand in hindsight was not entirely accidental. She was there when I arrived. We ate breakfast. We talked again. Less about me this time, more about her. She had a 12-year-old boy named Danilo and a 9-year-old girl named Precious. She worked shifts at Negros Oriental Provincial Hospital as a nursing aide. Long hours, modest pay, the kind of work that uses up your body. Her husband, she told me plainly, had gone to Manila 4 years ago for work and had gradually stopped being in contact. No formal separation. Not divorced. She mentioned this without drama, just as a fact. The Philippines has no divorce, she said, just annulment, which takes years and costs more than she would earn in several years. So, he was simply gone. She had the children and a rented room and her shifts, and that was the shape of her life. She told me all of this without self-pity. That was what struck me. No performance of suffering, no sideways glance to check if it was landing. Just the facts of a difficult life, delivered the way my colleagues at Arigna used to discuss hard conditions underground. This is what it is. This is what we're working with. No use carrying on about it. I respected that. I still do. We began meeting most Saturday mornings, and then occasionally during the week, if her shifts allowed. We'd walk along the boulevard after breakfast sometimes. She'd point things out, the name of a tree, a church she'd attended as a girl, a jeepney route that would take you somewhere worth seeing. I was learning the city through her eyes, which felt different from learning it through my own blundering around. More like being shown something than discovering it. I want to be precise about what the relationship was at this point, because it matters. It wasn't romantic. There was no hand-holding, no implications, no late evenings. If you'd watched us from across the street, you'd have seen an older man and a younger woman eating breakfast and occasionally walking and talking. You might have made assumptions. The assumptions would have been wrong, at least then. What it was companionship. Plain, ordinary companionship. Which I had not had since Mayray died, and which I had apparently been hungrier for than I'd understood. The first money came out of nowhere. Or seemed to. About 6 weeks in, she mentioned her motorbike needed a repair. A brake cable, nothing serious, but she needed it to get to the hospital for early shifts, and she wouldn't be paid for another week. She wasn't asking, she was just explaining why she'd be late the next Saturday. I said, "What's the repair cost?" She said 4,500 pesos, about 80 euro. I said I'd cover it. She said no, she couldn't. I said I could. She said it wasn't right. I said it was fine. Eventually she accepted. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. 3 weeks after that, a school uniform for her eldest. Danilo needed it for the new school year. She'd been putting it aside from her wages. but a hospital bill for a colleague she'd lent money to had set her back. 2,800 pesos. About €50. Less than I'd spend on a round of drinks in Roscommon without blinking. I gave it without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? My hands had spent 3 years managing someone else's needs. They remembered exactly what to do with this kind of request. They practically reached for my wallet before my brain had finished thinking about it. Looking back now, I understand that this was the mechanism. Not greed, not manipulation in the cold-blooded sense. Just a man whose entire identity for several years had been built around taking care of someone, meeting a situation that required exactly that. I didn't walk into a trap. I walked toward something that felt like purpose. There is a difference, though it doesn't change where you end up. About 2 months in, the message about the medication came. Neline's mother lived in Negros Occidental, in the province. Hypertensive and diabetic, both conditions requiring daily medication. The mother's medication for the month was 6,000 pesos, about €110, and the salary timing was difficult. Just this once, she said, until things straightened out. I said, of course. Of course. What kind of man lets an old woman go without her heart medication over €100? Not any kind of man I'd recognize. That payment was in month 2, just to be clear about that. We were 2 months in. By month 4 I knew the family. Not personally, not all of them. But I knew their names and their situations and the general shape of the difficulties in each of their lives. And I'd come to know this the way you come to know the layout of a mine, gradually, section by section, until one day you realize you could draw the whole map from memory. The mother was Nane Sita. She lived in a barangay outside Hinobayan, down in the southern part of Negros Occidental, in a small concrete house that Neline had been sending money home to help maintain for years. Hypertensive, diabetic, both conditions requiring daily medication, no health insurance to speak of because health insurance in the provinces costs money that provincial families don't have spare. I'd seen her on video calls, a small woman in her 60s who held the phone too close to her face and said, "Salamat po, thank you," whenever Neline mentioned my name, which I found unexpectedly moving. Then there was Ariel, the younger brother, 29, who kept almost having a job in the way that certain people always seem to be 3 weeks away from something that never quite materializes. He was in Dumaguete for a period. Then he went back to the province. Then he was in Cebu, looking at opportunities. Neline spoke about him with a mix of affection and exhaustion that I recognized from people I'd known in Ireland who had a brother or a cousin of the same type. Not malicious, just unmoored. A sister in Cebu, Maricel. Her husband drank. 2 boys in secondary school there, nephews whose school expenses kept arriving in the conversation with the regularity of a tide. That was the family. Mother, brother, sister, nephews. Neline was the eldest daughter, which, in this country and this culture, meant she was also, in every practical sense, the spine. Now, I want to stop here and say something because I think it matters. There will be people watching this who hear that list and immediately think, there it is, the setup, the scam, the family, as extraction mechanism. And I understand why they'd think that. But I'd ask them to consider what it looks like from inside the skin of a man who grew up in rural County Leitrim in the 1960s and 70s. My own mother was one of 8. My father was the eldest son in his family, and carried obligations to his siblings and his parents that were simply understood, never discussed, just part of the landscape of what being the eldest meant. When my aunt needed her roof done, my father organized it. When my uncle lost his work, my father helped. That's just what families did. The Catholic west of Ireland and the Catholic Philippines are separated by 12,000 kilometers and a great deal of heat. But this part, the eldest child, carries the family. That part one understood in my bones. It wasn't foreign to me. It was familiar. That was the problem, if you want to put a fine point on it. I was perhaps the worst possible man to be suspicious of a Filipino eldest daughter's family obligations, because I had a template for it that made it look completely normal. It looked like home. The medication arrangement for Nanay Sita had, by month 4, stopped being temporary. The salary timing issue that had made it necessary the first time never quite resolved itself. I didn't push. 6,000 pesos a month, about €110, to keep an old woman's blood pressure and blood sugar managed. I set up a recurring GCash transfer, which is the Philippine version of a bank transfer on your phone, and that was that. It just became a standing line item. I didn't think about it any more than I thought about my own utility bills. Around the same time, Neline mentioned that the apartment arrangement was becoming difficult. Her rented room was small, fine for the week when the children were in school and she was on shifts, but on weekends when she had them, it was cramped. She said this neutrally, not as a request. But I'd already been thinking about it. My apartment had 2 bedrooms, and I was using one of them for nothing. It seemed wasteful. I moved to a larger place down the same street. 18,000 pesos a month, instead of 21,000, actually slightly cheaper because this one was older but with a proper second bedroom and a kitchen table that could fit 4 people. Neline and the children began staying on weekends. Danilo was quiet and serious and read constantly. Precious was lively and called me Tito Brendan, which Neline had apparently encouraged. Uncle Brendan. I didn't correct that either. I should tell you about the refrigerator, because it's the moment I think about when I try to identify where the entanglement became something I couldn't look at squarely. Neline mentioned in passing that the house in Negros didn't have a working refrigerator. The old one had broken some years ago and hadn't been replaced because there'd always been something more pressing to spend the money on. Food had to be bought daily because nothing kept. In that heat, that's no small thing. I found a second-hand refrigerator, they call it here, at a shop near the market. 8,500 pesos, roughly €150. Had it arranged for delivery to the province. About a week later, Neline showed me a video call with her mother, Nanay Sita, standing in front of the refrigerator, touching the door of it like she couldn't quite believe it was real, saying something in Hiligaynon that Neline translated as, "She's saying God sent you to us." I am not going to pretend that didn't affect me. It did. I'm a 65-year-old man from Leitrim, who spent the last years of his wife's life watching her suffer and being able to do almost nothing. Being able to do something small, something concrete, something that produced a look on a woman's face like that was not a feeling I had any defense against whatsoever. I was learning the cultural language in real time, I should say. I'd done reading before I came, knew a little about utang na loob, the debt of gratitude that's woven into Filipino family relationships, the idea that kindness creates obligation, that receiving help binds you to the person who gave it. I understood intellectually that in this culture, a man who helped was being placed in a particular role, something like the OFW, the overseas Filipino workers who go abroad and send money home, except I was the foreigner fulfilling that function from within. I read about it. I thought I understood it. Reading about it and living inside it are different things. Inside it, it doesn't feel like a cultural system. It feels like your life. There was a Sunday morning at the cathedral around this time I'd kept up the habit, the Sunday Mass, the candle for Mary Ode. An older man came and sat beside me in the pew afterward, while I was still sitting with my thoughts. Australian, I gathered from 2 sentences, long married to a Filipina from this province, been here 15 years. We talked briefly, the way strangers do in churches when the talking is quiet and neither of them has anywhere to be. He asked how long I'd known her. I said a few months. He nodded slowly in the way of a man choosing his next words carefully. He said they're good women, mostly. He said, I'm not saying they're not. Just how long you've known her is worth keeping track of. I said I appreciated that. I didn't. I didn't appreciate it at all. I found the implication offensive, if I'm honest. The suggestion that what I had with Neline was the same as whatever cautionary tale this man had in his head. I actually thought this, that he didn't know what he was talking about, that he hadn't met her. Looking back now, I want to go and find that man and buy him a decent meal and tell him he was right and I was an idiot. But there it is. We believe what we need to believe. And what I needed to believe at that point was that I'd found something real, and that believing it was keeping the lights on in a way they hadn't been in a very long time. Ariel came to Dumaguete in month 7. I'd heard enough about him by that point to have a picture in my head, and when I met him the picture was mostly accurate. 30 years old, broad-shouldered like his sister, with an easy smile and the particular energy of a man who is enthusiastic about whatever he's currently enthusiastic about, and will be enthusiastic about the next thing with equal conviction when the time comes. He was friendly, genuinely friendly, I think. He called me Kuya Brendan, older brother, it's a term of respect, and shook my hand firmly and asked me questions about Ireland with what seemed like real interest. 85,000 pesos he needed, about €1,500, to cover the tricycle purchase and the remaining registration costs. I sat with the paperwork for a while. I'm a man who spent his working life reading conditions before committing to them. I looked at the documents. They looked real to me, and I want to be fair to myself here, because I think they probably were real documents, or close enough to real that the distinction didn't matter at that point. What I didn't ask, and should have, was whether the business itself was solid, whether the route was profitable, whether anyone had looked at Ariel's history with money and thought carefully about what they were actually funding. I told myself this was how it worked everywhere. A man needs a start. You help if you can. I'd seen my own father lend money to a cousin for a van in 1978. The van never quite paid for itself, but the cousin never forgot the gesture, and that counted for something too. I transferred the 85,000 pesos to Ariel's Gcash that afternoon. 3 weeks later, a typhoon came through Negros Occidental. It wasn't a catastrophic one, not the kind that makes international news, but it did damage. Provincial houses take a battering in a serious storm, and the family house in Hinabayan had an old roof that had been patched and repatched over the years. The damage was real. I have to say that clearly I believe the roof was genuinely damaged because the typhoon was genuinely real and the house was genuinely old. The repair estimate came to 120,000 pesos, roughly €2,100. I noticed the timing. I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure in a shaft, not with alarm exactly, more with a kind of heightened attention. A thought crossed my mind that I immediately felt guilty for having. 3 weeks after giving money to Ariel, here was another significant request. I pushed the thought away. It was a typhoon. Typhoons don't wait for convenient timing. Old roofs don't negotiate. But I didn't go to inspect the roof. That's the thing I come back to. I could have gone. It was a ferry and a bus, an afternoon's travel. I could have stood in front of that house and seen the damage with my own eyes and verified the estimate against what was actually there. I didn't go. I told myself it was a long journey for Neline to arrange, that it would seem like I didn't trust her, that the amount wasn't so large as to warrant the trouble. The truth, if I'm being honest about it, is that not going was a choice I made because going might have shown me something I wasn't ready to see. I understood that even then, somewhere quiet and underground in myself, I just didn't act on it. Not one sent the 120,000 pesos. I told myself we were building something together, her family and me, and that this was what building something looked like sometimes. The house conversation started around month 9. Looking back, I can trace it through 3 or 4 weeks of talking, not as a single proposal but as something that grew in stages, like it was an idea occurring to both of us naturally, rather than something presented. Neline mentioned first that the provincial house was really too old, too small, that her mother deserved better after a life of hard work. I agreed. Then she mentioned, some days later, that the family had land her grandfather's, a hillside above the barangay, good land with a clear title. I said that was fortunate. Then she mentioned that building materials had become cheaper in the province since the typhoon, local suppliers overstocked. I nodded. And then, one Saturday morning at the Carinderia over breakfast, she said, and I remember this precisely, she said, "Kuya, what if we built something there? Something that was ours." That word. Ours. I hadn't heard that word directed at me and meaning anything real since Myriad. We have a house. We have a life. Ours. I sat with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands and felt something move in my chest that I couldn't have put a name to cleanly, but that had the general shape of hope. She suggested I see the land first. Of course, no pressure. Just come and see. We took a bus from Dumaguete to the ferry port, then a ferry to Negros, then a hired jeepney up into the hills south of Hinabayan, 2 hours from the coast. The air changed as we climbed cooler, greener, the smell of something growing rather than something frying. The barangay was small and quiet. Chickens. A sari-sari store with a hand-painted sign. Children who stopped to stare at me with frank curiosity that I found more honest than the studied indifference of the city. The land was at the top of a rise above the barangay dread soil. Volcanic and rich-looking. Mango trees along the edge. A view of the hills rolling away to the south with the sea just visible on the horizon on a clear day. It was, and I want to say this clearly because it matters, it was genuinely beautiful. I am not a man who uses that word carelessly. I stood on that hillside and felt something I hadn't felt since I was a young man in Roscommon looking at the fields above Loughallen. The feeling that a piece of land could hold you, could become something. We met the grandfather briefly, a small, dignified man in his 80s, who had the title documents in a folder he kept under his bed, and who showed them to me with the gravity of someone presenting something precious, which I suppose he was. The title was in his name. The land was genuinely the family's. That part was true. The architect's quote came back at 900,000 pesos for a solid 3-bedroom house, about 16,000 euro. A proper house, not grand, but permanent. I did the reading I should have done earlier. Foreigners cannot own land in the Philippines. That's the law, straightforwardly and without exception. A condo in a city building, yes. Land, no. The workaround was to build on her family's titled land, with the structure legally attached to that title. I'd read about this arrangement on expat forums. Some men did it. It was a risk, everyone said so clearly, because you had no legal ownership and no recourse if the relationship ended. I read all of that. I understood all of that. I decided that didn't apply here. I decided Neline was different. I have no defense for that decision except to say that I was a man in the 9th month of feeling alive again, and that the hillside was beautiful, and that she'd used the word ours. I transferred 680,000 pesos, approximately 17,000 euro, as a first tranche to an account in Neline's name. The contractor was arranged. Neline sent me a photo of the site the following week, a man with a measuring tape, marking out the footprint of the foundations in the red earth. I saved that photo to my phone. I looked at it more often than I'd like to admit. There was something in it, a rectangle marked in red soil on a green hillside, that felt like an answer to a question I'd been carrying since I sat in that chair for 4 hours on a Tuesday morning in November with the rain going sideways outside. I was building something. At 65. I was building something rather than ending something. I should have gone back to that hillside the moment the photos stopped coming. But I didn't. Not yet. The photos stopped in week 3, not dramatically. No message saying they'd stopped. Just 1 week, there was a photo. The following week, there wasn't, and the week after that, there wasn't either. I sent a message asking how the construction was going. Neline said, "Good, going well. The contractor was making progress." I asked for a photo. She sent one the next day, a slightly different angle of the same foundations I'd already seen, taken in different light. I couldn't be certain it was a new photo. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The explanations came in stages, the way water finds its way into a shaft slowly, from several directions at once, each trickle individually manageable. The contractor had a family emergency in Cebu and was delayed 2 weeks. Then the price of hollow blocks had gone up because of supply issues from a nearby construction project competing for materials. Then the barangay captain needed certain things attended to before the permit could be fully processed. A facilitating payment, Neline called it, just how things work here. Kuya. You know how it is. Each explanation individually credible. All of them together producing a stillness in me that I recognized from underground. In the mines, you learn not to panic. Panic underground gets men killed. When something changes a sound, a pressure, a shift in the air, you go still first. You read it. You don't move until you understand what you're dealing with. I'd spent 40 years cultivating that stillness. It was keeping me calm now in a way that wasn't entirely healthy, because staying calm was also making it easier to stay where I was instead of acting. 11 months in, I took the ferry to Negros. I didn't tell Neline I was going early. I told myself I wanted to surprise her with a visit. Looking back, the truth is, I wanted to see the site without anyone having time to prepare for me seeing it. I hired a jeepney from the port and went up to the barangay. The hillside was, as I remembered, red soil, mango trees, the sea on the horizon. I found the site without difficulty. The foundations were there. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what comes next. Real concrete, real work, properly poured and set. I walked the perimeter. I crouched down and ran my hands along the edges the way a man who spent 40 years underground touches structures to understand them. Solid. Genuine, not nothing. I photographed everything methodically. Every corner. Every wall line. The rebar stubs where the walls were to rise. I sent the photos to myself, and then I went back to Dumaguete, and I found, through an expat Facebook group I'd been mostly lurking in for months, a contact for an independent structural assessor, a retired Filipino civil engineer who did exactly this kind of evaluation for foreigners who'd invested in construction and wanted an honest accounting. His name was Engineer Ramos. He charged 5,000 pesos for a site visit and written report, about €90. He went to the site separately without me on a Tuesday. He sent his report on the Thursday. I read it twice before it settled. The foundations represented approximately 180,000 pesos of actual construction work. Not 680,000. 180. About €3,000 in materials and labor, against the 17,000 I'd transferred. Engineer Ramos was precise and unemotional in his assessment, the way professionals are when they're delivering news they've delivered before. I sat with that number for 2 days. I didn't contact Neline. I ate my breakfast at the Carinderia. I walked the boulevard. I went to the cathedral and sat in a pew and said nothing to anyone, not even to Myriad. I just sat. On the third day, I asked Neline to come to the apartment. I'm going to be honest with you about what that conversation was like, because I think people imagine these confrontations as explosive raised voices, accusations, the dramatic unmasking. It wasn't like that. We sat at the kitchen table where the children had done their homework on weekend evenings, with cups of coffee that neither of us drank much of, and I told her what Engineer Ramos had found. Quietly. I laid out the numbers. I asked her to explain the difference between what I had transferred and what was on the ground. There was a silence. Not the underground kind, not the absence kind. A different kind. The kind where someone is deciding how much truth to offer, she cried, quietly the way she did, everything. And God help me, I have to say this because it's the truth, I nearly let it work. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I'd watched my Dad cry in pain for 18 months. Actual pain, physical suffering, and I'd been able to do nothing. My entire nervous system had been rewired, somewhere in those months, to respond to a woman's tears as an emergency requiring immediate action. Neneline's quiet crying hit that rewiring directly. I felt my hands move toward her across the table before I caught myself. I stayed where I was. I asked her again. She admitted, gradually, that the money had moved. Some of it to Ariel, not the tricycle, it turned out, but gambling debts that had become urgent in a way she hadn't wanted to explain to me. Some of it to Maricel's husband's problema in Cebu, the details of which remained vague despite my asking twice. The contractor had been paid a portion. The rest had dispersed, was the word she used. She said she had meant to tell me. She said she had been ashamed. She said, "Mahal kita," I love you. She said it 4 times in the conversation, and the 4th time she said it, I understood that I was watching a woman use the only tool she had left that might still work. I told her I needed some time to think. That evening, Sinaded rang from Dublin. She rang most weeks. She'd graduated from occasional check-ins to regular calls over the preceding months, the frequency increasing in proportion, I think, to her private level of concern, which she'd been too careful to express directly. We had the usual conversation for a few minutes, and then she said, "Dad, can I tell you something someone told me?" She said there was a woman on an expat wives forum she'd been part of for a few months, an online community, Irish and British women married to Filipino men, plus women whose fathers or brothers had come out here. She said this woman had mentioned a name, Neline, from Negros Occidental, a nursing aide in Dumaguete. She said the woman knew this name from someone else's story. A Dutch man, retired engineer, 2 years before me. Same area, she said, same family land. I didn't say anything for a moment. Sinead said, "Dad, I'm not saying it's the same person. I'm just saying someone told me the name." I said I'd look into it. I thanked her. I sat on the edge of the bed in my apartment, with the ceiling fan turning and the street noise coming through the louvered window, and I thought about a hillside with red soil and mango trees and a rectangle of concrete that wasn't worth what I'd paid for it. I went back to Neline the next morning. I asked her directly about a Dutchman, an engineer. 2 years ago, she was quiet for longer this time. Then she said his name was Pieter. She said he had been here for 8 months. She said things had ended badly. She said the land was real, the family was real, she hadn't invented any of it. She said the situation had been difficult. She said she had needed things she couldn't get any other way. The foundations on that hillside, it turned out, were partly his foundations. He had paid for the first pour 2 years ago. Then he had left. Then the land had sat. Then I had arrived, and the project had, in a sense, resumed. I asked her if she had loved him. She thought about it for a moment. She said she didn't know. She said she had needed him. She said those weren't always the same thing. I believed her. About that part. About that one specific thing, I believed her completely. She wasn't a monster. I keep saying this, and I'll say it again, because it's the truest thing I know about the whole experience. She wasn't evil. She was a woman with 2 children, and a sick mother and a useless brother and a disappearing husband, living in a country where there is no divorce and no safety net, and no mechanism except family and ingenuity and whatever resources you can locate. I was a resource, a warm one, a kind one, a resource that had genuinely cared about her and her children, and the look on her mother's face when a refrigerator arrived, but a resource. Awe in her world that had its own coherence. I understood it. I even, sitting at that table with the cold coffee between us, respected it in a grim kind of way. That didn't change what I had to do next. I took the ferry to Cebu the following week. There's an expat lawyer there. I'd seen his name mentioned on the Facebook group several times, always in threads that began with some variation of "I need advice" and ended with figures that made my situation look modest. His office was in a building near the IT park, air-conditioned to the point of hostility, the kind of cold that feels aggressive after months of living in actual heat. I sat across from him for 2 hours with a folder of documents that I'd assembled with the same careful thoroughness I'd have brought to reading roof supports, transfer receipts, screenshots of Gcash transactions, engineer Ramos's written assessment, the architect's quote, the title documents showing the land in the grandfather's name. He read through everything without hurrying. He asked a few questions. Then he set the folder down and told me what I already knew. Voluntary transfer of funds to a private individual. No written loan agreement. No construction contract in my name. No legal ownership of the land or anything built upon it. No formal relationship established in any document that would give me standing to claim anything. From the perspective of Philippine law, I had made a series of gifts. Gifts, by definition, are not recoverable. He said he was sorry. He said he'd seen this many times. He charged me 12,000 pesos for the consultation, about €215, and I paid it without complaint because he'd been straight with me, which was the least expensive honesty I'd purchased in 14 months. On the ferry back to Dumaguete, I sat on the upper deck with the sea going past and the sun doing what it does here in the late afternoon, going orange and enormous toward the horizon. And I did the accounting. The construction money, 680,000 pesos, approximately €17,000. The roof that I never went to see, 120,000 pesos, roughly €2,100. Ariel's tricycle, that was never a tricycle, 85,000 pesos, about €1,500. The medication, 18 months of it, 6,000 a month, 108,000 pesos, close to €2,000. The apartment upgrades, the refrigerator, the school fees, the small things that accumulated across the months like sediment, another 150,000 pesos, give or take. Approximately €2,700. Add it all together, and you get roughly 1,143,000 pesos. €34,000, more or less. Against the 155,000 I'd arrived with, I had about 121,000 remaining. The damage, in pure financial terms, was real but survivable. I want to be accurate about that rather than dramatic. Some men lose everything. I did not lose everything. But that's not the accounting that keeps me awake. The accounting that keeps me awake is the other one. 14 months. That's what I spent. 14 months of feeling like myself again, or maybe not like myself exactly, but like a version of myself that had a purpose and a shape to the day, and a reason to eat breakfast at a particular table, and a small girl who called him Tito, and a woman who listened to him talk about things he'd never talked about to anyone. 14 months of not thinking about Marirad's kitchen every morning, 14 months of building something, or believing I was. That's the sum that doesn't balance. I'd already lost Marie Reed. And now this, whatever this was, had been taken too. And what's left is a 65-year-old man on a ferry watching the sun go down over the Visayas Sea, trying to work out what he does with his hands next. I booked the flight 2 days later, Mactan, Cebu to Dubai, Dubai to Dublin. 3 weeks' time. Sinead has a spare room in her house in Ranelagh. She's been careful not to say, "I told you so," which is a generosity I don't entirely deserve. I went to the Carinderia on one of my last mornings and sat at my usual table and had my sinangag and my 2 coffees and watched the street do what it always does. The tricycles, the students from the university walking in pairs, the stray dogs conducting their unhurried negotiations, the smell of garlic and diesel, and something sweet from a bakery somewhere nearby. Nene Coring brought my second coffee without being asked, the way she always had, and I sat there and thought, this part was real. The mornings were real. The boulevard was real. The cathedral was real. The candles for Myriad were real. Not everything that happened here was false. I want to hold on to that because it matters to me, and because dismissing it entirely would itself be a kind of lie. I didn't go back to say goodbye to Neline. I thought about it. I decided it wouldn't serve either of us. If you're watching this and you're planning to come here or you're already here, thinking about a woman, thinking about some land, thinking about a project that feels like it might become something, I want to say this one thing as plainly as I can. I knew what wound I was carrying when I arrived in Dumaguete. I knew I was a man whose purpose had died with his wife and who was walking around with his hands empty. I knew I was hungry for someone to need me. I could have told you all of that if you'd asked me directly on the day I bought the ticket, and yet I walked here and sat down at a plastic table and found someone who needed me, and my hands reached for it before my brain had finished thinking, and I was surprised by where I ended up. That's not the Philippines' fault. That's not Neline's fault, not entirely. That's what an honest wound does when you don't dress it properly. It finds its own dressing, and it's not always clean. Know why you're going. Know what's missing. Know the shape of the hole before you go looking for something to fill it. Because if you don't know it yourself, someone else will find it for you, and they'll be gentle about it, which is the most dangerous thing of all. That was Brendan, 65 years old, County Leitrim, Ireland, a man who spent 40 years underground learning to read the silence, and who, when it mattered most, chose not to listen to what it was telling him. We talk a lot on this channel about scams and red flags and warning signs, and those things are real and worth knowing. But Brendan's story is about something that doesn't have a checklist. It's about the particular vulnerability of a person who has lost the thing that gave their life its shape. Grief doesn't make people stupid. It makes people hungry. And hunger, in the wrong conditions, makes people make decisions that have nothing to do with stupidity and everything to do with need. Neline was not a monster. The Philippines is not a trap. What happened on that hillside in Negros was two people from vastly different circumstances, each trying to get something they needed, and only one of them fully understanding the terms of the transaction. That's the story we keep seeing here, not cartoonish villains and naive victims. Just people. Just meeting need, with an ocean of cultural difference and power imbalance sitting between them, and nobody quite willing to name what's actually happening until it's too late. Be careful out there. Know yourself before you go. And if you're already there, and something in this story felt familiar, slow down. Go and see the roof. Ask the questions that might show you something you're not ready to see. Because the things you're not ready to see are exactly the things you need to look at. That's all from us today at Inside the Philippines. If Brendan's story helped you, or if you've got one of your own to share, you know where to find us. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you in the next one.